I was slow to get up some of the lectures for you, but they're all there now. And full confession, they're slow because I have all these visions. I'm no Hollywood performer, right? There's lots of information here, but there's a room to improve in terms of a slick performance, and I don't give you folks that. Granted. And so I have these visions of, editing and things like that where I stumble, etc. But it just doesn't fit into the week, unfortunately. Um, so there's that. Sometimes um, unrealistic expectations can contribute to procrastination for students and professors and people of all ages alike. And so that's a little bit of what's going on there. Apologies for the bungles, but there it is. Okay, the origins of the Cold War. We're gonna talk about that, but I want to start out a little bit with the Eastern Bloc areas, and just walk through a little bit how the Eastern Bloc got formed, what it really, what it was all about. And we know this already. We've read Yalta, and so we have a real solid idea of the tensions that were afoot there. And but let's put on our radar screen. So I've kind of two goals for this, or three goals for this lecture. One, I want us to survey the Eastern Bloc and how it comes under Soviet rule. Two, I want us to have a really good understanding of George Kennan, the X telegram, what containment policy is. And then three, I want to talk about how the Cold War plays out in the international arena. We won't move fully through time in the Cold War. We won't get to Afghanistan or probably the Sino-Soviet split, but we'll get we'll talk hopefully about Korea, Vietnam. All right. So the Eastern Bloc, what was it? How did the Soviets control it? And, in terms of institutions. If we remember, the war ends and Russian soldiers are in Germany. They get to Berlin. This right here is a map of the occupied zones of Germany at the end of the war. And the Soviets are here. Britain, America, then they pull France in, as we read about. They combined their zones into one. But the Soviets don't. This is one of the clearest areas where the alliance is breaking. As we read in Yalta, that that real difference of perspective, that Britain formally gets into the war to defend Polish sovereignty and Stalin won't budge on Poland, already shows us that there are cracks coming. And then in the wake of the war, it ends even, you know, how does this all play out? So May 9th, war ends for the USSR. In August 1945, after the United States drops two atomic bombs on Japan, the war ends entirely. Um, and the US had actually just declared war shortly before its surrender. Now, in the fall of 1945, there was a survey in the US, and the survey question was, do you fear the USSR? Overwhelmingly, not a worry. Stalin in the United States was referred to as Uncle Joe. In the fall of 1946, 1 year later, the same survey question was asked, and the answer was much different. Fear of the USSR had risen significantly in this survey responses. In many ways, fear of the USSR was the fuel of the Cold War. So, what had happened in the meantime? Well, one thing that had happened was Winston Churchill's graduation speech in Fullerton, Missouri on March 6th, 1946. Boy, did they get out early, huh? Or was it a graduation speech? The and this speech was called the Sinews of Peace, where he makes this now delivers this so famous passage that I'll even read it again. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, I can't do Churchill's voice, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and all the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. And so here's where he's announcing all has not gone as we intended it to. So the members of the Eastern Bloc, who were they? Well, it's East Germany, because Poland's been partitioned. It's Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia until 1948. Until 1948, Tito effectively resisted. It was a very tense situation, and uh, um, he even sent at one moment a message to Stalin saying, quote, "Stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them, one of them with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow and I won't have to send a second." Joseph Tito. Um, and so definitely put up a good struggle, ultimately unsuccessful against the kind of machinery of the Soviet Union. And Albania was also in the Eastern Bloc. It kind of got out earlier, 1960. Different story. But so how was it formed? What was the rationale from a Soviet perspective? Well, the rationale from the Soviet perspective was that some of this territory had been part of the Russian Empire, right? We got to think on this question. When you in Kennan's long telegram, how much does history matter? We could ask that question of the long telegram. We could ask that question of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And we can also ask the question, how much of this is Soviet? How much of it is about Marxist ideology, how to build a socialist state? And how much of it is about geopolitics? Like we'd say geopolitics if we mean that competition between states in a sort of timeless way, or and I could insert again history that the Russian Empire had been this great big territorial entity. So um, pretty much the Allies they had these 3 big conferences in Tehran, 43, Yalta, 45, Potsdam, 45, to try and manage. Certainly Churchill isn't blind to the potential problems here, and we'll talk a little bit about that. They've tried to work out these tensions ultimately in a way that well, as Bush put it in his speech in the 90s, ultimately in a way that Eastern Europe loses out if we value freedom and autonomy and sovereignty, because they're certainly not that. So there's um, there's these ideological differences. The Soviet Union and the Allies are very much different. And one of the ideas had been that the revolution is going to spread to the world. And we've talked about this, and it was an intention. It is part of the theoretical, the theoretical makeup of the theory is that if you are going to eliminate the chaos of markets, and if you are going to eliminate imperialism, much better if we all have the same system. And so the organizational structure, the common term had been the Soviet Union formed the Third International. Remember those um, dissident revolutionary socialist parties, the First International, the Second International. Now they formed the Third International. Even in the naming, that says, this is how we are. Um, okay, it sounds cynical. I'll use the word going to plot to spread our our system throughout the world. And so the Third International, the Comité International, the Comintern, you know, the Soviet Union had Washington, D.C. had nothing on the Soviet Union and its love of acronyms and alphabet soup. It existed from 1919 to 1943. The point of this organization was to foment world revolution, of course. And the Soviets, of course, we see that Stalin early in the 20s does make a retreat of sorts. And he says, well, we can have socialism in one country, or we will build socialism in one country first and then worry about the other stuff. But we still have, the common term functioning. Um, they pretty quickly realize this isn't going to work. This kind of now that we're in power, this what began as a granted subversive organization to spread revolution isn't going to really work as our foreign policy arm. And so it looked like, Stalin was making this concession when he dissolved it in 1943 as a gesture towards the Allies, because, they know what this is for. And then what they formed instead, well, NATO gets formed in April 1949. I'm jumping way ahead. And then they'll form first the Common Form, called short for the Communist Information Bureau. That exists from 49 to 56. The idea of it is to counter NATO. The goal is to coordinate among all the world communist parties. And it's kind of a successor to the Comintern, and that's sort of the organization for, communicating with our party members, our allies in the world. And then the bigger organization, of course, which we talked about, the Warsaw Pact, which was formerly called the Warsaw Treaty Organization of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. Um, and that is a security alliance, and it exists until 19, it exists 1955 to 1991. Okay, so now in the Eastern Bloc, what are these countries doing? Well, they want to um, they basically infiltrate the political institutions. Let's take Poland. So Poland, they have a government in exile, and this has happened before. And the Soviets form, and remember at Yalta, um, Alan says, but wait, we have this other Polish government in exile, this Soviet-backed Polish Committee on National Liberation. All the words are really good. And they said, we'll put, you've got a government in exile, we've got this government in exile, war there in Poland. How about we put in this government in exile? And the resistance did not go down easily at all. Stanislaw Mikolajczyk, the prime minister of the government in exile, he formed the Polish People's Party. They resisted pressure to back down for elections, and the Soviets implemented a terror. There were 100,000 arrests prior to the first election, and the election is widely understood to have been rigged to secure a win for the communists. The Poland officially became the non-democratic People's Republic of Poland in 1949. Resistance continued, however, from 1944 to 1952, so that's almost a decade, 8 years. Over 500,000 people were arrested for political crimes in Poland. So it doesn't just turn over, but all of this history. We talked about the Katyn massacre, the Soviets pausing while the Nazis annihilated Soviet Polish nationals participating in the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. All of these, I mean, in addition to a long history of foreign relations, although that was very much marked by friendship as they allied against the Turks from, say, the 1680s to the late 18th century. Well, no, early 18th century. By the late 18th century, Catherine is disappearing Poland. But so all of this contributes to tense relations and a long and troubled historical memory between Russia and Poland. I mean, I think that it's one of the reasons why, and you've heard me say this, I'll say it again. The history between Poland and Ukraine is not all candy and candy either. But in the wake of the full-scale invasion by Russia, Poland has really stepped up to defend Ukraine in a way that I've been in the streets of Krakow and talked to Poles who say, "Oh yeah, we've got to, we've got to step up." And I think it's no accident that three of the scholarly voices in the United States right now who have been the most vocal kind of pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian voices in this moment are Tim Snyder, Marcy Shore, Ann Applebaum. And these are all people that start with the history of Poland. I mean, well, Marcy Shore as much the Austrian and Habsburg Empire, but these scholars really have their roots in many ways in studying the history of Poland, and so I understand and appreciate their perspective right now, which is very much Russia should be checked. Um, because this isn't the first time that Russia has acted like this, and and the way to get Russia to not behave in rogue and expansionist ways that violate the sovereignty of other countries is to check it. Okay, so that's the deal in Poland. In Hungary, however, you had a leader, Rákosi, who was considered Stalin's best disciple, and they impose kind of with less coercion from Moscow, a fairly brutal regime initially. Czechoslovakia is also a story where there's a good amount of communist support, and the leader agreed to unconditionally follow Soviet policy. They'll agree to such an extent that initially they were allowed to maintain their own political structure. But that didn't last too long. And then, even as early as 1948, the Soviets back a coup, putting their own person in place. Romania is declared a People's Republic in 1948. Um, so in the Soviet Union, the death penalty was abolished in the USSR in 1947, but not in the Eastern Bloc. And the Bulgarian leader in 1949 and Hungarians in the same year who were not sufficiently in Moscow's pocket were denounced, arrested, and executed. And so they kind of through how whatever they kind of determined how much they identified people they wanted it in charge. I mean, and now I'm generalizing. They had elections that they made sure that they won, and some were fraudulent and rigged. And then they had people in power that were taking their orders in large part from the party leadership in Moscow in running their own countries. Um, Another organization that gets organized is the Comecon, and this exists from 1949 to 1991. And this is an organization on economic cooperation, and it was formed as a counter to the European economic community. And in the early years of the Soviet Union, the Soviet what one of the things this organization did was engaged in intellectual exchange. So now we're in the sphere of science and scholarship. And in the early years, the Soviet Union is taking, you have a lot of very excellent educational institutions, scientists in Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and they are kind of taking information from them. The idea, the Sophia principle that they articulated in from a conference in the city of Sofia was that they would have shared intellectual property. Ultimately, we look back now and say this discouraged innovation. It and there was a sort of socialist idea to it that it would bring advantage to the technologically behind members. So kind of an affirmative action for technological advancement. We'll share. Um, and then there was sort of forget, your own kudos and reward and advancement. And it's seen now that this led to a discouragement of innovation. Why bother? If I have a good idea, they're just someone else is going to take it. I'm not really going to get credit for it. And when the Soviets, however, began making technological progress, they rebuild, they invest in literacy from the bottom up, they invest in universities and science, and they get an atom bomb in 1949. Then, when the Soviet Union began making technological progress in excess in the 1960s, then they rethink the principle. So I find that there's a cynical way to look at that. But so this is kind of how the Eastern Bloc is in large part functioning, take over, infiltrate the political party and apparatus, have an election, generally a single candidate. There's intimidation if need be, falsify results, as was the case in Romania, declare a friendship of peoples. And in the Baltics, the Soviet line was that the Baltic people requested to be annexed, requested to be brought into the Soviet family. And so they did. The Soviet leadership went to great lengths to make it look democratically based, make it look like they are not engaging in imperialism. And I mean, think back again to all those confessions that were collected during the purges. This is a state that it was very important to be on record as being on the up and up, doing the right thing in its own terms. But this history, you can't with a straight face hold that line when you look at this history in so many ways. And once they were in there, once they managed to establish a people's republic, the Moscow functionaries were the political leaders. There were strict media controls. There were strict immigration controls, right? Freedom of travel, something that we generally assume. And I mean, kind of as an aside, some ideas to kind of police women that might be seeking an abortion over state lines. That is an idea for someone that values that sort of the liberties that come with being an American and freedom of movement. That's a horrific idea, but in the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, there wasn't freedom of movement. And that's think about when the whole system started to crumble, with the Berlin Wall coming down, it really began over this. I mean, the catalyst was saying, okay, some people can travel freely across this wall. And it unleashed something that was unstoppable. And it certainly wasn't what Moscow was betting on or counting in the moment. But so that freedom of movement is really uh, an issue. There was also throughout the Eastern Bloc Soviet-style secret police. There's this, I highly recommend if anyone's seen this movie about the East German Stasi of, what is it, Other People's Lives? Forgive me if I'm forgetting the title, but kind of a painful portrait of the kind of compromises that so many normal people made living in a state of coercive surveillance. There was in the Eastern Bloc schools, there was mandatory Marxist-Leninist school curriculum. I can't even tell you in my travels how many people from Eastern Europe I've encountered where Russian ends up being a common, I don't know their language, but we can talk in Russian. And maybe their Russian is kind of rusty because they learned it in school a long time ago. And often they don't want to speak Russian. They don't like Russian. They don't like having been forced to learn Russia and having been under, behind the Iron Curtain but we can talk to each other. I've had that experience in Poland and in the Baltics and with Romanians and Bulgarians as well. So and it's because they had to learn Russian and Marxist-Leninism in school. And then there's also a degree of economic integration. I won't get into the weeds on this, but industries are nationalized and they are incorporated into the Soviet 5-year plans. Later, it doesn't all work, but the but that was part of the idea. That's kind of part of how the Iron Curtain worked. Um, at first, this in the wake of the Soviet, in the wake of World War II, at first the Soviets and some are takers. I mean, they're rebuilding too. These countries are destroyed. Later, in the later Soviet Union, the USSR doles out more aid to Eastern European countries in some than it takes. And this is one of the reasons Serhii Plokhy, who wrote Yalta, also wrote this book, The Last Empire, and where he takes us back to 1991, where things are falling apart. And one of the reasons many leaders in the Soviet system are willing to say, "Hey, let's jettison the republics, let's jettison Eastern Europe. It costs so much." And we'll talk more about that. We'll read more about that in Armageddon Averted as well. Okay, that's sort of the story of um, the Eastern Bloc, in very perfunctory terms. Now let's talk about George Kennan. So in terms of the origins of the Cold War, we said that Winston Churchill, gives this speech. It's a moment. When we ask the question, when does the Cold War start? That's sometimes given as an answer. And I told you about this poll. Again, it was September 1945 by Fortune, and only 25% of the people believed that the USSR would try to spread to Eastern Europe when asked in this poll in September of 1945. They redid the poll in July of 1946, and over 50%, quote, felt that Moscow aimed to dominate as much of the world as possible. And it's from the 1940s that you start to see in American universities, there's this sense we need to understand the Soviet Union, and Sovietology emerges. You have many, history departments are staffed with. You would have a medieval historian, an imperial historian, and a Soviet historian, because it was understood that there was this sense that we really need to understand what this entity is. And believe you me, the origins of kind of Russian history in the United States of America was studying the revolution. How did a revolution like that happen? Um, don't get me started on that. And now Russia is again behaving as a rogue state in contravention to the international order to which it itself has signed on. Are we seeing greater interest in Russia? I don't know that we are. Certainly, if in the 40s and 50s and in the height of the Cold War, many universities had three, kind of chronological periods of a Soviet expert, now you see that almost in no places. When I started graduate school in 2000, there were 13 universities in the United States that had staffed three Russian or Soviet or imperial historians, and now there's three, I believe, if that. And one of them just announced retirement soon, which I doubt that will be replaced. And certainly things change. In the wake of 9/11, those Russian historians would retire, and there was this understanding, oh, we should understand the Middle East and know more about Islam than we do. And then also, there's this moment, oh, China is really emerging as a world leader. We should have a historian of China and better understand the world of East Asia. So there's, and also with an understanding of kind of the racial divides in America that still persist. There's been a long recognition that we should have more historians of the Black experience and slavery and immigration from Africa. So trends change over time. And the Soviet Union uh, is getting less and less studied. At any rate, George Kennan, who was he? George Kennan, oh my goodness. George Kennan was the author of the Long Telegram, also known as the X Telegram. He was the grand nephew of another George F. Kennan who lived from 1845 to 1924. And that George F. Kennan was the author of a book called Tent Life in Siberia and also Siberia and the Exile System. And remember when I told you about this trip I took to Kamchatka, where I hooked up with some people who I knew, like, I didn't really know them, but the mom, basically, of this guy who was the wife of the president of the World Bank in Moscow. And I can remember sitting at a table with him once, and he said, "You know what? The thought that really keeps me up is that if every Russian cashed in the dollars under their mattress tomorrow, the value of the dollar would half." Which at that moment says something about just the strength of the dollar as a world currency. And sure enough, it is. And it's one of the things that the BRIC countries would like to change. And there's some hope that this move to reinstate an antiquated protectionism in a globalized world can go some distance in helping to weaken the dollar as the world currency. The strength of the dollar, many analysts think, is one of the things that, despite all trouble signs, the U.S. stock market continues to do well. But if there was a real chink in that, and these tariffs, if followed through, could help accomplish that, then that kind of world currency is likely to change, as Putin would very much like. At any rate, so Michael Carter was, but in the 90s, in the early 2000s, it was still unquestioned. The dollar is the thing to have. I did know some people that, well, maybe I should store a few euros, maybe some yen, so a little bit of hedging the bets in terms of what goes under the mattress, but the dollar tried and true. Anyway, it was Michael Carter's wife who said, "Oh, you can go to Kamchatka and meet up with my son," who, and here's an example of the barter economy and that kind of chaos of the 90s, who did the English voiceover for this environmental film, this environmental documentary, but they didn't have any money to pay him. So they said, we'll take you on a trip through Kamchatka and you can go along. So that's how I ended up in Kamchatka. But while I was meeting up with them, I ended up crashing on the floor of this volcanologist. And in his apartment, he had a copy of Tent Life in Siberia. And so I got to read it by this guy on the left about, he was like a 20-something person, and there's this idea we're gonna lay a cable across the Pacific Ocean and then all across Siberia in order to connect the capitals of Europe to the telegraph, at that point, capitals of the West in America. And so he was part of an exploratory route to be like, will we do it? Pretty much on the boat ride over, he writes about how seasick he is. And then he has this, writes about his adventures moving from Kamchatka westward. It ends up, they laid an Atlantic cable before the Pacific idea failed in that moment. So it's kind of a history of failure. But I was so fascinated by this book. It maybe has something to do with me later in life deciding to study Russian graduate school. And my first book is about Siberia. And I had this dream of maybe retracing his steps anyway. Well, George Kennan was also fascinated by his trip, and he went back and he traveled through, he went back on other trips. And he also wrote this 2-volume book, Siberia and the Exile System, where while he was traveling across Siberia, he interviewed all these people that have been exiled to Tsarist prisons, not the Gulag. I mean, yeah, not the Gulag. There's even one book that, well, I don't want to trivialize imperial prisons because that's not right. But there is a historical study that seems to demonstrate that there was a seasonality, like people could escape and go do something else for the summer. And then when maybe food was more scarce and they didn't have something to do, would come back. And as we know, Trotsky and Lenin have like write their best work while they're in exile or in czarist prisons. None of that sort of thing happened in the Gulag. Um, but so George Kennan is mostly, or in large part, talking to political prisoners. These are people that have the worst view. I mean, they have been denied the life they wanted to lead because of their political ideas in large part, and they're educated. And so these are the people that he's interviewing. And he comes back to the U.S. and makes a career as a lecturer. And if you read it, this is very much the line of, this is a brutal regime where there is no freedom. Um, and perhaps it's no surprise then, or, in the family lore, George F. Kennan comes along, young diplomat, and he gets posted in Moscow. Um, and he is asked to, oh wait, let me return to my, let me return. So he's in Moscow in 1946, and there's these international institutions are forming. There's going to be the IMF and Bretton Woods Conference, and all this stuff is emerging. And the U.S. sends a note to the embassy in Moscow, and basically they're saying like, "What's the deal? We're trying to form a World Bank and an IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the Soviets are totally not on board. Like, we don't get it. We thought we were allies and we thought we're going to build this world order together, and they don't even want to participate. What's going on?" And George Kennan writes the answer, and he sends it in a telegram, the long telegram. It's called both the X article or the long telegram. X because he just signed it X. And then it gets published in 1947 in the journal Foreign Affairs with the title Sources of Soviet Conduct. And in this, he writes out his understanding of the Soviet Union, and Russia. It's not just it's not just linked to it's not just linked to the Soviet Union. He gives a larger historical perspective. And given the experience of his long uncle, of his granduncle, and the particular experience he's had there, where he interviewed so many people that were victims of political oppression in the Tsarist prison system, we can, to me, that really informs the way he understood the Soviet Union and its predecessor, the Russian Empire. And he ends up at these places. And I really want you to read this carefully and ask yourself, what role does history play in this? He ends up with this standpoint of U.S. policy that the Soviet Union doesn't believe there can be genuine conversation, genuine cooperation with the United States of America. That's his understanding. Do we have to claim? We don't have to accept that. That's his understanding. And he felt that coping with the Soviet Union was the greatest task our diplomacy has ever faced. And he proposes the logic of containment. Not outright military conflict, but containment. They are what they are, and it should be our mission that they do not extend their influence any more than they already have. And he thinks that one of the ways to do this is that the American public must be educated about Soviet life. And he actually, we have to rise up here. We have to wrap up here. But as you read this, I really want you to, at the end, what does he say? And what does George Kennan say about the importance of American democracy, Western democracy, and the importance of healthy American institutions in preserving freedom and combating the spread of Soviet influence? All right, we'll end with that.